Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be speaking with you today about the three core processes our teams have employed to see better results at Heap. I've been practicing product management for almost 10 years and just over 2.5 years here at Heap. And today I'll share some of the lessons that I've learned and some of the best practices we've implemented and fine-tuned specifically at Heap for uncomplicating product management. First, just a little bit about me. My name is Vijay, and I'm a director of product management here. And before I joined Heap, I worked on a variety of products, mostly at Google, ranging from display advertising to next generation email and calendar tools to talking robots. And I joined Heap because I instantly saw its potential to elevate the discipline of product management. And I'm excited to dig into that very subject today. First, as a bit of context, Heap is an analytics platform that helps product managers and really any digital builder, regardless of role, craft great digital experiences by turning their behavioral data into action, founded in what customers are actually doing. This is a topic I came to Heap already really passionate about, and I've seen firsthand how the right data foundation can unlock the right insights. And paired together with the right processes, how PM teams completely transform into this well-oiled optimization machine that puts the customer first every time. My goal today, by the way, is not to sell you a product. My goal is to tell you about how my teams use an automated data foundation and these three distinct processes to optimize our product design and engineering work, and how these structures ultimately together improve our business. And at Heap, one of our core values is to taste the soup. So this includes not only heavily using our own product, but also creating, practicing, and sharing best practice processes for digital product development. So know that everything that you see here today is a real practice implemented by a real product team with real learnings and real impact. With that, let's jump in. So if I asked what the typical division of labor is between product managers and engineers, how would you answer? Right? I suspect many of you would say something like product managers list requirements and engineers go build them. As common as that notion is, I want to tell you it's wrong. But why? A key, and I would argue that the key role of a product manager is to frame problems to solve. And lead cross-functional teams to come up with impactful solutions, not to define a solution up front. So given this idea of the role of a PM, what distinguishes good PM practices from the best PM practices? So here are my top three behaviors that you can employ to really move the needle and change how your teams work with your product teams work with your design and engineering teams. Good PMs will focus on telling you what to build, celebrating launches, and accepting inherent complexity. But great PMs, on the other hand, great PMs will really focus on telling you why you're building something, celebrate the impact that you're creating rather than the fact that you launched something at all. And they'll actually really push for simplicity rather than accepting that complexity. But we'll dive into each one of these individually. So first, let's start with why, right? The single most important thing that a PM should care about every day with every heartbeat is why. In today's world, all of us get caught up from time to time in the next flashy new bell or whistle. And we don't stop enough to really ask why. And by the way, this is by far and away my number one piece of advice for PMs, because it puts your customer at the heart of what you're building. Good leaders are really always going to align their team around why. And it's worth remembering that engineers are at their core problem solvers, right? So if you give them a good problem, they're going to help you solve it. But you can't just give them the solution up front, because if you give them the solution up front, they're not going to be able to identify edge cases, propose alternatives, or help you think through trade-offs. So instead of throwing the what over the fence, you should bring engineers as close to the problem and state the why. It's really important to share context around the problem and the pain points. So that means bringing the customer or user stories to the forefront, showing relevant research and user data, and sharing quotes from customer interviews, or even consider hosting a visit or a virtual visit with customers so that your engineering team also can hear about the problem and empathize with it firsthand. And all of this really builds up the team's awareness of the pain point that they're solving, and ultimately the outcome that they're trying to achieve, both for the customer and for your business. And this may seem obvious to you, but it's not obvious to someone who doesn't spend all day in the product. And, that includes your engineering team and your design team especially, right? So why do we care about how many people, for example, use some widget? Like, why does the conversion rate on some funnel matter, right? You have to ultimately connect it back to the company's strategy and the overall business impact every single time. So I'm sure you're thinking, of course, Vijay, this is obvious, but easier said than done, right? How do you make this a part of your work culture? Well, at Heap, we've implemented a few tools and simple processes to drive this kind of alignment and strategic thinking. So here's our first step. We actually have a ritual kickoff meeting at the start of every project. So in this meeting, we'll have the engineers who are likely going to be working on the project, the PM, and the designer who's going to be working on the project, as well as at least one representative from a customer success team or a customer-facing team. And the goal of this is to align on the content of what we call a problem brief, which is a document that lays out what problem we want to solve and why we want to solve that problem. So let's dig into that. A problem brief is a formalized, organized worksheet that we use as a team to clearly define that problem that we want to solve before we talk about how to solve it or what the solution might be. So at Heap, problem briefs are really designed to produce a set of user stories and one or more product hypotheses. So the key is that we do all of this work, aligning a cross-functional team, creating shared customer context on a problem, making a measurable hypothesis without prescribing a solution. So solution ideation comes later and very, very distinctly and separately. And the meat when you're framing the customer problem is the user story, right? So this usually comes in the following format, right? So as some persona, right? And so that's really who you're building for. That might be a specific role. It might be a specific audience of your customer base. So as a persona, I want to do a job, right? So at this point, you really need to dig into what are the actual underlying workflows that this persona has and what's getting impeded, right? Like by the problem that you're trying to solve. And so I want to do a job so that my business has an outcome. And it's really important to capture the why here of why you're actually solving the customer's problem. This is where I see a lot of product managers go astray, is that they'll basically say, as a user, I really want to see a green button over here to bulk add people to a folder or a project, right? And there's no why, right? And in that situation, you don't know how important of a problem this is. You don't know like the depth to which you're actually solving something that's going to be valuable to your customers. So it's really important to state that outcome that your customer and your target persona is really trying to achieve. Again, common mistake that I've seen is product managers creating this like flat list of requirements that doesn't really have any signal on the relative ranking as well. So it's super important to actually to rank these. Because when you start engineering work on a project, inevitably you're going to reach a point where you need to make a trade-off, right? Do you push the launch date, further out, and include functionality that addresses a specific user story, or do you launch without it and do it as a follow-up later? It's crucial to know before these decision points come up which capabilities are must-have versus nice-to-have. You don't want to be caught in a corner and making a rush, knee-jerk decision about something like that. And I've often heard that there needs to be like a quote healthy tension between PMs asking for more scope always and engineers saying that it can't be done. This can honestly, I believe this mentality can lead to teams being intellectually lazy and not gathering customer context that can easily provide objective answers to these questions. There's a lot of techniques you can actually use to answer this kind of question and grab this information. One that I often really love to use is surveying customers about their needs, using, for example, a question that's like, how critical is this capability to your use case? Or describe to me how you would use this. And I use Likert scales a lot. So like a 1 to 7 scale of this is really not relevant at all to this is critical and I need it. Or like I would use this less than monthly versus I would use this daily. All of these are signals that give you a good idea at a glanceable, actionable way, what your actual stack rank is. And also what is truly a must-have versus what is a nice-to-have among a set of possible requirements. The other key piece of this is a product hypothesis. So a product hypothesis is a statement that spells out what problem you're trying to solve and hypothesizes about what the impact of solving that problem is actually going to be and how you're going to measure whether or not you drove that impact. So it usually has a kind of similar structure. So there's some user account segment. Again, this is who are you actually targeting? Experiences some negative outcome, right? And because, and this is where the hypothesis comes in, like we're changing X because we believe that X is the reason customers are having a problem. And so we expect that some specific change that we're making will cause some measurable specific behavior change on the part of the user. And so when you tie it back to behavioral change, you can really sensitively measure, whether your hypothesis was right or wrong. And so, ideally at the start of a project, you're quantifying these negative outcomes, right? And so that could be, if it's internal facing, support ticket request volume, or if it's really directly customer facing, failure to complete a multi-step workflow, so poor conversion rates, low adoption or retention of a feature that you care about and you've been investing in, et cetera. And you want to establish a baseline for this behavior that you want to measurably change. And it's worth noting that in the cases when you're creating a new surface or a new product feature from scratch, you may not be able to explicitly establish that baseline. But it's important that you return back to this and really think through even an estimation of what that baseline could be, right? And that might be based on adjacent behaviors that indicate that who your addressable market is for a given feature or improvement that you're making to your product. All right, let's move on. There's a lot more, by the way, in the problem brief that I'm not going to get a chance to cover here. I want to remind you that you can download the full problem brief that we've written up as a template, as a resource for everyone at the Heap website. And so this actually has it has a much more complete template, as well as an associated blog post that kind of goes into a depth on all the different parts of that template. And I really encourage you after the session to read that and take a look at it and see what parts of it, if not all of it, you may want to employ in your practice. So now that we've talked about explaining the outcome that you're going after, let's talk about the solution space, right? So you've done a kickoff, you've gotten a group of people together who are going to explore the solution space with you, cross-functional group. You've aligned on what the problem is. So let's talk about the solution. So after you've written up a problem brief, we use a tool called a design brief to outline and discuss a proposed solution. And usually at Heap, a designer is actually driving the process of a design brief. But remember, just like everything else, it's created collaboratively with lots of stakeholders and partners. So what you want to do is you want to get together with engineers and PMs before you really write down anything or do too much thinking on your own. You should discuss potential solutions, their feasibility, anything that might be a major difficulty. And for smaller projects, your design brief might just be a summary of that conversation. For larger ones, you might do a bigger discovery exercise. You might run your own dedicated brainstorming session, sketching session, a really deep competitive analysis. So it's really going to vary in scale, but the idea is generally the same. So it might take a few hours, or it might take a few weeks. But the idea is, adjusted to the scope of the project. Try and keep it as lean as possible. So when you fill in your design brief, in general, as much as possible, you want to make this as short a process as you can. And sometimes, to give you a sense of it, a couple pages of text and a few sketches like the one you see right here does the trick. And in general, you want to avoid mock-ups or even wireframes. They'll take significantly longer and they'll focus the discussion at the wrong level. So for example, the sketch that you see here on the left accompanied a design brief, a real design brief at Heap for our report alerts feature. On the right, that's a screenshot of what the mock-up looked like for that same dialogue. And the key thing to note here is that we focused on staying at low fidelity. So that sketch drawing was one of many variations that we explored in the process of reaching this design brief. So the team ritual that's associated with the design brief is something we call a product quality review. So the way this works is the team goes over both the problem and the design brief with your leadership team to get input, other feedback, and build alignment early. So at times this can look like, the feared, fabled design review, but it's not. We try to avoid a process where executives are litigating design details. That's why staying at low fidelity is really important. Rather, the goal of the product quality review is to ensure that we're making good trade-offs among product quality, project scope, and timeline. And it really seeks to avoid the situation where a project has to undergo significant rework late in its life cycle because there wasn't strong enough alignment around the framing of the problem, the approach to the solution, or how that solution was chosen among a space of possible options. So by doing product quality reviews and by using such a low fidelity artifact in them, we're able to make critical decisions about project work, including and especially whether or not to proceed at an early enough stage that neither design nor engineering time is really needlessly wasted. So a design brief covers a variety of facets of your proposed solution. So today I'm going to talk about what I believe is the main part of any design brief. It's something that we call the foundations. And really, if your design brief had one section, this would be it. And its goal is to outline the key details of your solution and the constraints within which it exists. So there's 4 components that we have in these foundations. Let's use a simple example of adding emoji support to a messaging app, right? Something everyone can relate to. So behaviors are basically answering the question without really getting deep into the step-by-step. What does your design do? So for example, add an emoji button to the message input that produces a pop-up menu with a set of emojis that you choose. Next is assumptions, and assumptions really just asks, what are the critical assumptions about maybe the who or the why or the what that underlie your solution. So for example, maybe we say, we assume that we're content with a relatively small subset of the entire world of emojis. This is a key place where you might be wildly misaligned with other stakeholders. And it's a great opportunity to make sure that you're on the same page about the right details or the persona or where you ultimately want to stand in terms of against your competitors. And so it's important to really list out these assumptions very clearly. So next is key constraints. So key constraints asks, what are some of the non-obvious constraints that are shaping or limiting your solution? So for example, in this case, you could say licensing for emoji graphics means that unless we design our own, these are going to look very different on different platforms, right? Kind of an obscure limitation that might be surprising late in the game and is really valuable to state early on. And then last is discarded alternatives, which really looks at what options did we look at but eliminate, and why did we eliminate them? That why is key. So this is really useful to answer questions of the variety of, well, why not just do X, right? I'm sure everyone has heard some flavor of that question in a review, and especially if that review is late in a project lifecycle, it's a real bummer to have that conversation. And by the way, on occasion, you may want to pursue multiple distinct solutions and bring multiple solutions into the review and talk through the pros and cons of each of those. That might be the case in some cases, and the feedback that you get might help you land on which one you want to go with. So by the way, I want to call out that this last one, this discarded alternatives, this is the #1 reason that I see teams do multiple product quality reviews. And this is something to be celebrated, right? They realized that they hadn't fully explored the solution space, and they were able to quickly iterate and align with leadership before an engineering team really got started on building any kind of implementation, or before a detailed set of mockups was built. So a lot of time is saved every time you have to go back to the drawing board when you're doing it this early. So just like with the problem brief, there are a lot more components that make a great design brief. I hope you check out the full template for this on our website. Remember, if you invest the time upfront to frame the problem as well as your exploration of the solution space, you're going to have a much less turbulent journey going from problem to solution. But let's not forget that product development doesn't end with a solution. That brings us to our next topic. Remember that you are not hired to ship things. You're hired to drive real impact, and it's important to make sure that your team celebrates that impact, as well as the learnings that come from maybe failing to generate that impact. It's really easy to get stuck on the launch treadmill. You know you're on the launch treadmill when you spend month after month launching features, and you don't ever seem to have time to go back and learn what worked and what didn't. There's always a next feature that needs to be started right away, a customer problem that's really urgent, and we just spent all this time getting to launch. Surely now is the time to relax and start thinking about, the next project, right? Well, wrong. This is something that I think every product team I've ever been on has struggled with in some way, shape, or form. It's so easy to just move on to the next thing. And I want you to remember that the great PMs don't let their teams fall into this trap. They know that what really matters is the impact, and so they make sure to stay laser focused on what these outcomes are. So how do you make this part of your culture? It has to be baked into your definition of success. Your product team should be setting goals in terms of value, not volume. You make sure that you celebrate impact, right? Not just shipping. And the feature isn't done until it's having the impact that you really aimed for. And this goes back to that first point, right? When you orient your teams around the why, you don't stop working on the product after it ships. You have to measure whether it is having the impact that you expected up front when you made your initial hypothesis. You have to iterate because you're not always going to get it perfectly on the first try. And in fact, I will tell you for a fact, you should just assume you will never get it right on the first try. It's always going to take multiple iterations. So enter after action reports. This is one of my favorite tools. These are organized reports that we write every time we ship a new feature. And we find the experience extremely useful for developing our products and staying agile as we figure out what works and what didn't work. We believe that it's crucial for product management organizations to maintain these activities for a few reasons. First, it enforces accountability for PMs on a project-by-project basis, rather than waiting for semi-annual performance reviews to really drive accountability, which is really an anti-pattern. It increases agility. So that means that your whole team, your whole organization is making more informed decisions faster. And last, it celebrates learning. Product development works best when it's run as a series of educated experiments. And actually, in fact, we share our after action reports company-wide because it's important to celebrate these learnings and the impact that we're driving transparently as an entire company. And product managers are ultimately seeking to drive impact and make high ROI investment decisions. So a good chunk of after action report is actually dedicated to capturing how long was spent on a given project and with how many resources. If you combine this with the results against your initial hypothesis, right? So remember, in a problem brief, you outline these measurable hypotheses. Now you're closing the loop, right? And so if you combine this with your initial hypothesis, and you have a great opportunity to reflect on the project as a whole, right? Would you have done it again? How might you have delivered more value to the customer sooner? How might you have de-risked the solution that you ended up choosing, especially, by the way, if it didn't drive the impact you were going for? These are questions that you should ask for accountability, but here's the added benefit. They're going to supercharge your learnings as you go into the next project. The aggregate benefit of this exercise of reflection is that your teams will learn and grow faster. I've personally seen this with myself and with PMs on my team. Their after action reports, as well as their problem brief, right? The way they start new projects now versus a year ago are night and day. And this regular act of reflection, I believe, is a huge part of my and their personal growth. So like other processes, right? The after action report is something that we have available as a template, accessible on our blog. We have a lot of great details in there about how do you really articulate your learnings. One thing I do want to call out about after action reports, especially when you're using an analytics tool that's built on an automatically captured data foundation, is that you can go down an amazing rabbit hole when you're doing these after action reports. Because usually what happens is when you're following up on that initial hypothesis, you start to discover that every question you ask begets several additional questions, right? And when you have a tool like Heap, what's really powerful, and I've used this a ton of times myself, is you realize there are adjacent behaviors that you weren't really paying attention to, that you wish you kind of understood in the context of how they were impacting the metrics that you were measuring for your hypothesis. And you can actually go in and augment your data set on the fly and then instantly have access to all the data going back to when you installed Heap. And so you can kind of answer those ad hoc questions that come up when you're writing an after action report in seconds. And it's pretty wild and a lot of fun to do. So I recommend you try it out. Not telling you anything. Again, we built this into our product development process to make sure that we're always following up on our hypotheses. And also culturally, so that we would let the data teach us as an organization a bit of humility, right? Don't assume that you're going to make a giant plan and get everything right the first time. Let the data guide you and help you recognize when you're having impact and not having impact, and be humble about your learnings. So let's talk about the third area, simplicity. Great PMs don't just accept complexity, they push for simplicity. And I actually think this is broadly true and speaks to something about the real nature of a PM, whose main job is to tame the complexity of a business problem and organization into something that a team can digest. But today we're mainly talking about metrics, and it's here, especially that simplicity is key. It's really easy to tie yourself into knots coming up with a perfect KPIs for your product. I've seen this time and time again, and you have teams that are trying to create the perfect bulletproof metric or set of metrics, and what ends up happening is that one isn't enough. You create 5 metrics or 10 or 20, and you're trying to watch everything. And then the reality is that trying to watch 20 metrics turns into actually watching 0 metrics. And as a PM, it's definitely your job to be on top of all these metrics. So you absolutely should build dashboards at your leisure of all the different supporting metrics. But when it comes to actually aligning your organization around a goal, it's really important to push for simplicity. You want metrics that everyone on your team can recite without even really thinking about it, metrics that just live at your fingertips. So take, for example, you want to take your complex user dashboards and just turn them into a few key metrics that you look at more often. So let's say, for example, you're working on a free trial program in your app. You look across all your metrics and dashboards, and you boil it down to 3 key metrics that capture the important steps in your flow: new trials that are getting created, trial conversion rate, and the percentage of accounts with at least some number of interactions per month. Dead simple. Is it the full picture? Absolutely not. But it's capturing the key stages of the customer journey, and it's simple enough that you can remember it and keep coming back to it. And that means that they're going to be really easy for your team to understand and align on. And simple doesn't have to mean less powerful. This is actually something that we learned recently at Heap. One of our data scientists actually did a meta-analysis of our product metrics several months ago, and they looked at a variety of different ways that we measure product adoption. We had tons of different goals that we were looking at, and they had the goal of identifying which of those metrics is actually predictable of renewals. They considered about 30 different user behaviors as well as different thresholds of usage on these behaviors, and they looked at how these behaviors correlated with renewal of our annual software contract. Ultimately, the learning was the simple metric of how many people run a query. We're an analytics tool. Run a query is the best predictor, and that's a really powerful realization. And it drove a deep sense of focus across our company, because it showed that we don't have to make adoption more complicated. We don't have to look across dozens of different use cases and usage patterns. We don't have to look at whether they're using some feature or the other, some complex query or a simple one. We could just set a simple goal: increase the percentage of accounts that are above this threshold of usage that was correlated with an account being more likely to renew their contract. That's it. It's simple, it's tied to business impact, it's memorable, and it's actionable. So what are the key changes that you can make to better align your teams between product and engineering? Just as a recap, right? You want to explain the why. You want to celebrate impact as an organization. And especially when you're talking about aligning your team around a goal, you want to push for simplicity. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be sticking around after to answer any questions or discuss further. And there's a link here if you want to grab the slides or any of the resources that I referenced here. So just go to heap.io/product school. Hope you have a great day.